BJ Penn in his prime can claim to be one of the best fighters in UFC history. He is only one of few fighters in UFC history to have won 2 belts in 2 different weight classes. With a dominant win over Jens Pulver in 2007, the following year, 2008, saw the best version of BJ Penn. A focused BJ Penn, a determined BJ Penn, with dominant wins over Joe Stevenson and Sean Sherk. BJ Penn demonstrated why he is a true mixed martial arts prodigy. He peaked at number 4 in the MMA pound-for-pound rankings around the time Fedor Emelianenko, Anderson Silva, and GSP were dominating. That run he went on made him a true legend. That's why it was so sad to see him go out the way he did. Penn lost his lightweight title to Frankie Edgar at UFC 112 and then suffered a defeat to him again in the rematch. Signs of the old BJ Penn returned after he knocked out Matt Hughes, but then would go on to lose all but one of his next 8 fights. BJ Penn eventually called it a career in 2019 and hasn't fought since. Discussions about the greatest of all time in the UFC will always feature Anderson Silva's name. He holds the record for the longest title reign in UFC history at 2,457 days and secured 16 consecutive victories. Anderson Silva was number 1 in MMA until he faced off against Chris Weidman. The Brazilian was a heavy favorite going into UFC 162, but Chris Weidman pulled off one of the greatest upsets to knock out Anderson Silva in the second round. With this defeat, the era of invincibility that had previously surrounded Silva vanished, and it was only about to get worse for the Spider. Cause in the rematch, Anderson Silva went for a leg kick, only to suffer one of the most gruesome injuries in UFC history. After he broke his leg, he was never the same. He would eventually return to the octagon in 2015 against Nick Diaz, but would fail a post-fight drug test, and his legacy was tarnished. But he would still show signs of vintage Anderson Silva, like his fight against Daniel Cormier, where he almost finished Cormier at the end of the fight, or the fight against Israel Adesanya that was surprisingly competitive, since Anderson Silva was past his prime. After he broke his leg against Chris Weidman, he just won one of his last 6 fights before retiring in 2020. But you have to think that if he would have just retired on top, he might still be considered the greatest of all time. The combination of knockout power and high-level wrestling made Tyron Woodley one of the greatest welterweights in UFC history. He entered UFC 201 with an MMA record of 16 wins and 3 losses, and went on to defeat Robbie Lawler, who at the time looked like nobody was going to beat him. The victory gave him the welterweight title, and he held on to the belt for 945 days, until Kamaru Usman took his soul. Since then, Woodley went from the pound-for-pound best welterweight on the planet to a joke in the MMA community, constantly chasing to be the fighter he once was. The knockout power just seemed to have disappeared. He just looked like he lost all his confidence. He failed to win any of his next 3 fights, and already on Dana White's hit list, he was axed from the UFC after a 4-fight losing streak. Tyron Woodley's longtime training partner Ben Askren became the first UFC fighter to become a victim of YouTuber turned boxer Jake Paul's right hand. Tyron Woodley saw the opportunity to get his career back on track by attempting to beat Jake Paul. He got knocked out cold by Jake Paul in the second fight, and he face planted right in front of Mama Woodley. And that was the last we ever heard of Tyron Woodley. It's a shame because up until all Tyron Woodley's losses, he was a very respected fighter. Now, Tyron Woodley is just an afterthought. When the UFC wanted to introduce a women's division, it was Ronda Rousey that was chosen as the headline act. Her defeat over Liz Carmouche for the bantamweight title began a period of dominance. But Rousey's UFC career came crashing down at UFC 193 at the hands of Holly Holm, who had not been given a chance by most, but she would go on to land one of the most iconic knockouts in UFC history. A brutal head kick from Holly sent Ronda to the Shadow Realm, giving her her first loss of her MMA career, after Rousey stated that she would retire undefeated. And Dana White and Joe Rogan were hyping her up so much that everyone actually believed that she was unstoppable. The legend of Rousey ended that night, and she fought just one more time in the UFC, but got knocked out under a minute by Amanda Nunes before running to the WWE. There's talks of Ronda Rousey coming back to the UFC, but I truly think that she's done, and she made a big impact on the sport, but she is remembered more for her knockout losses than anything else she contributed to MMA. In the early to mid-2000s, MMA was still an unknown sport to many, but Chuck the Iceman Liddell was one of the most important fighters in making MMA a mainstream sport, and was the first star the UFC ever had. He not only looked like a dude that fights in a cage, but he had that ability to get people excited whenever he would step inside of the octagon. His exciting fighting style of keeping fights on the feet and delivering brutal knockouts made a lot of people want to watch the UFC at the time, where sports like boxing, basketball, and American football were dominating. Chuck Liddell really was the UFC's rock star in the 2000s. He was the first name people thought of when thinking about MMA. When Chuck Liddell was in his prime, from 2004 to 2006, he would go on a historic run of 7 straight knockout wins and looked unstoppable. What made the Iceman so dangerous was that he was known for having a granite chin, great takedown defense, and the ability to end the fight with one single strike. But eventually, all those hits he took during his career finally caught up to him, because at UFC 71, he would have a rematch against the last man to beat him before his historic title run, and his name was Rampage Jackson. In the fight, Rampage turned Chuck's granite chin into dust as he knocked the Iceman out cold in the very first round. After that, it all went down for the UFC legend Chuck Liddell. He would go on to lose a split decision against Keith Jardine, where he almost got KO'd again. Then he had a dream fight with the newly acquired Pride legend Anderson Silva, where the two would go on to have a slugfest, with Chuck picking up the win and returning to prime form. However, the next loss Chuck would suffer would be his worst, as he fought a young and hungry Rashad Evans, who brutally KO'd Chuck with a big right hand. Chuck Liddell started declining after the second Rampage loss, but he was truly never the same after the Rashad knockout. Chuck would then go on to get knocked out cold 2 more times before being forced to retire by Dana White in 2010. He then returned 8 years later just to get knocked out cold by his longtime rival Tilo Ortiz. Then he finally retired for good, realizing that his best days were behind him. Chuck Liddell had a legendary run, but it was ruined because Chuck Liddell was too tough for his own good. Other fighters might have went on losing streaks. Chuck Liddell lost 5 out of his last 7 fights in devastating brutal knockout fashion. A sad ending for one of the most legendary fighters, and in my opinion, the worst career ending in MMA history. But with that said, that's gonna be it for this video. I'm out this hoe.
Until he erase him. True to be tweaking like somebody laced him. I know some demons and proud with they Haitian. Niggas ain't dropping no bodies, they fake. They taking no passes if he wrote a statement. Taking no passes if he wrote a statement.